Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Michael Bell on the subject of the Middle East. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm a Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation and an Adjunct Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. Every week, we're joined on the program by an expert in global governance, international public policy, or some other aspect of external affairs. Today, my guest is Mr. Michael Bell. He is a Senior Fellow at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs and a Professor of Political Science at the University of Windsor, Ontario. He is also the former Canadian Ambassador to Egypt, Israel, and Jordan. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Very glad to be with you.
I wonder if we could start in Egypt. How would you describe the political situation in that country at the moment?
Well, I would say the emphasis we sometimes see on the turmoil and chaos is exaggerated. In other words, I think given all the circumstances that the country has been through, the overthrow of Mubarak, the accession to power of Mr. Morsi,
right,
the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, and now the takeover again by the military under General al-Morsi have been certainly disruptive, but I think things are on a pretty even keel right now, and the government seems to be making very, very serious efforts to return to a sort of normality,
right,
that we might have been used to under the Mubarak days. Not always perhaps a desirable normality, but nevertheless one that's predictable and has all indicators of a growing stability.
Right. Now, as you mentioned, the Morsi government was very short-lived. The subsequent elections were mired in controversy. Mm-hmm. Why has it been so difficult for democracy, though, to take hold in Egypt?
Well, first of all, I think there's no real tradition of democratic exchange, accommodation, a compromise, or pluralism. Egyptians are used to one party basically deciding most things, certainly everything to do with the security field,
right,
and really determining the economic course of the country. By that I mean in terms of what the emphasis will be on the private sector, what the emphasis will be on the public sector, who will make these ultimate decisions. Things move very slowly in Egypt. And I see, from what I'm reading, a return to the Mubarak years, albeit a harsher Mubarak, if you like, with Mohammed al-Sisi. But I suspect, aside from incidents where we will continue to see of those who are resisting this reimposition of this authoritarian regime or dictatorship, we're going to see a growing return to stability. The one exception is in the Sinai Peninsula.
Right.
And Sinai happens to be populated by various tribes and what have you, whereas Egypt is a relatively much more homogeneous society ethnically and culturally.
Right. And so for Egypt then, and given the unrest of the Arab Spring and Tahrir Square, do you see this continuing on going forward, or are we in fact, seeing a return to military-style rule?
We're seeing a return to military-style rule. We're seeing Mubarak plus, if you like,
okay,
a still harsher regime. I was there for 4 years during the Mubarak regime, and there was a lot of criticism. But there were avenues to voice a mild dissent as long as no action was taken and what have you.
Right.
I think that's much more restrictive now. So you went through this period where, with the overthrow of Mubarak, Egyptians generally, and I'm speaking of all classes of people, from the working class, from the peasants, right up to the intellectual elites, felt a new freedom.
Right.
an ability to express themselves. And I think we saw that in the press and in the media, which immediately became alive with the discussion of public issues and what have you. But that was viewed as too threatening. It is true that Mohammed al-Morsi took over power in a democratic election.
Right.
But many of the practices that he instituted from his perspective, his ideological perspective, really reflect that same authoritarian bent, that same lack of tolerance for the free expression of ideas.
Right.
In addition, the country was really crumbling, I think, because of mismanagement, inexperience, reticence to deal with the World Bank and the IMF, just a lack of familiarity and comfort with the governing process, both politically and socially and economically. So what you had is a slow disintegration of the Morsi regime.
Right.
And I think General el-Sisi, who had been, interestingly, kept on as Minister of Defense throughout the Morsi period,
Right.
was really the military's way of implanting their man at the center of events. And when we look at it in retrospect, I think it's easier to say that the military had never really decided to give up complete power.
Right.
They always wanted the option of returning to power, in what guise, in what manner, and how, perhaps to be determined. But when they saw the Morsi government falling apart, chaos in the streets, and a real dissatisfaction among the middle class and the upper classes, and I can't emphasize enough the disintegrating economy.
Right.
The inability to negotiate loans, the problem of feeding people. They decided that something had to be done, and they stepped in.
Right.
For them, this would be normal. For us, it would be extraordinary.
Right. Shifting gears to Israel, the peace discussions or the peace process has really stalled in recent months. Given the new government in Israel and the stakeholders around the table, do you see any hope of the talks being revived?
I don't think so, because I don't think there's a realistic basis for discussion. In other words, the present government is a very right wing.
Right.
Almost putting Mr. Netanyahu on the left side of that spectrum. And it's going to be dominated in many ways by the Jewish Home Party of Naftali Bennett, who is very, very rightist. And a lot of his ideas, shared by other members in the coalition, about the position of Arabs, not only in the West Bank, but in Israel itself, are going to be reflected in the attitudes of the government and in the way the government functions.
Right. And broadening out, Israel is surrounded by chaos right now. I mean, there's civil war in Syria and northern Iraq, refugee crises in Turkey, Lebanon. How is it reacting to the regional instability right now?
Well, in one sense, of course, Israelis are very fearful. I mean, having been founded in 1948 as a result of the British withdrawal from their mandate, and in an ensuing war of independence, as they call it, or Nakba, as the Palestinians call it, meaning the disaster. There's always been that fear of annihilation,
right,
especially with the legacy of European Jewry after, or during, and before the Second World War,
right,
and going back hundreds of years, in fact. So that's very much on the mind of your average Israeli, no matter how moderate or dovish they might seem to be. So when you have really a series of civil wars, both ethnocentric and ideological in the surrounding countries, the average Israeli is going to be very concerned about the implications of a Palestinian state emerging, which, if we want to use the term, in their minds could go bad as well.
Right.
In other words, it could be ultimately be radicalized. Jordan, for instance, is already under a lot of pressure.
Right.
Lebanon is under pressure. And I think Israelis want to avoid that at all costs. So that's the main factor motivating a lot of Israeli decisions. What that helps the government do is not only to have, overwhelming public support for a strong military defensive alliances with the United States and increasingly with Canada, to build up a solid network of security relationships with both countries like Canada and the United States, much more importantly, but also with what we could call status quo countries, or the conservative countries of the Gulf. So if we look at that, we've got the Gulf states, we've got Saudi Arabia, we've got Egypt, all of which are resistant to change.
Right.
They don't like what's going on for the most part, even if from time to time they may intervene on one side or another, or support a particular ethnic group or societal group. Nevertheless, they're greatly disturbed by the threat that this kind of disruption, this kind of fragmentation can spread to their own countries. And that's multiplied by what they all see as a threat from Iran.
Right.
Iran, the backer of Shias and other minorities in the region, for instance in Syria with the Alawites, and the Shia Hezbollah in Lebanon, can spread its tentacles, and that those tentacles will be disruptive.
Right.
So there's a comfort factor in having a solid nationalist government and power within Israel. And we saw that Mr. Netanyahu very cleverly exploited that in the build-up to the last Israeli elections, when he said, well, we'll never have a two-state solution under my regime, or we're going to have to introduce special measures to deal with the Arab citizens of Israel,
right,
and the like, that really upset the United States, that is, the United States administration of President Obama, and aren't going to be forgotten. But what they did is they consolidated a victory, which he may well have had in any event. A victory, I mean, not only for his Likud party, but for the center and right parties, which have traditionally formed the basis, the real power basis of any governing coalition in Israel.
So how are current relations between, say, Israel and Egypt, or Israel and Saudi Arabia right now?
I think those relationships are about as good as they can get. I suspect, it's a little more obvious with the Egyptians, that there's quite a bit of certainly security cooperation ongoing, not only with the Saudis, but with the United Arab Emirates, other Gulf states. With the Egyptians, it's more open because they see a common threat with Hamas, in the radical movement that controls in many ways, that does control in terms of governance anyway,
right,
the Gaza Strip, both of which they share borders with. And Hamas and still more radical groups to its right, if you want to use the term right and left, constitute to both of them a threat. And if we look at it as Egypt now, under Morsi, and Israel under any circumstances, being preoccupied with this threat to themselves, to their own internal stability, to their own internal safety, what we see is a congruence of interests.
Right.
If we don't have these radical movements, then it's going to be much easier to govern our respective countries. That's why you saw when the Israelis went into Gaza in response to Hamas attacks, rocket attacks into Israel.
Right.
The Egyptians were very benign in their response, and I suspect very satisfied that Hamas government's military apparatus was weakened.
Right.
They might not say that publicly, but privately they think has won on those issues.
Right. Now, the Middle East has always been volatile, but many observers have made the case that it is imploding right now. Why are things in the last few years, why have they been so dire? I mean, essentially, why now?
Well, that's a very good question, because it gives me an opportunity to say that in the years when I first went to and served in the Middle East in the 70s and what have you, and subsequently, everybody used to talk about how unchangeable these regimes were. Right. In Syria, Iraq, where have you, Saudi Arabia for that matter, Egypt. And that there was no mechanism or no means to change governance, the basic approaches of the autocrats to the governance process. Now, it turns out that those regimes were not quite as stable as people pretended they were.
Right.
In other words, they were built of concrete blocks, and when there was an earthquake, they collapsed.
Right.
And they opened up an ethno-nationalist sentiment and an ideological sentiment that had been there previously, but it had been in a way both suppressed but tolerated. In other words, when George Bush and the Americans went into Iraq, which really started this whole thing, in 2003, what they did is that they unleashed a series of forces, of ethnic forces, of religious and radical forces, whereby the ties that bound Iraqis together as a people showed themselves to be relatively quite flimsy.
Right.
In terms of their primal identification with their own communities, the Shia, the Sunni, the Kurds, Christians, and what have you. And it's very interesting in that context that, and we can look at Syria here too, both the Saddam Hussein regime and the Assad regimes were minority regimes. In other words, the Sunnis ruled essentially in Iraq. In Syria, you had the coalitions of Christians, of Alawites, although the Alawites constituted the main face of the regime, I guess. Virtually the Shia, the Ismailis, the Christians, up to 25-30% of the population, saw themselves as protected by this minority group from the domination of the majority.
Right.
And finally, that wasn't enough to stench the loss of legitimacy among these governments. In other words, you had the American intervention. That was enough to cause a collapse. Then, subsequently, elsewhere you had the Arab Spring. It signified that the governments in control in Libya, Syria, wherever, lacked the legitimacy to continue to govern, that peoples had no confidence that their government could deliver basic economic and social goods to them. that they couldn't tolerate a certain degree of pluralism that gave people an opportunity to express themselves. So they took to the streets, and they did so in a very demonstrable way. And I'm sure we can all remember the scenes in Tahrir Square in Egypt, which in many ways is the most vivid, at least in my mind, of these insurgencies. What happened, however, was that the old regime being gone, there was nobody that was capable of filling the organizational or sociological void.
Right.
So, without the army in Egypt, without the Assad regime in Syria, various groups began to fight for dominance. And that dominance presupposed a certain authoritarianism. In other words, the people that got started were pluralist enough. They wanted pluralism, they wanted freedom of choice and what have you. But when push came to shove, the people with the real power that had the ability to contest for power, right, through the military, through the security, through terrorism, through what have you, were not able to fill the void. And hence we have, because particularly of the ethno-national split in Syria and in Iraq, civil wars going on now and that seem interminable.
Well, and perhaps on that, in the situation in Syria, just last week the International Crisis Group basically conceded that the situation is intractable, that there's no hope of a political or military solution. Do you have any hope that the civil war can be resolved relatively soon?
Well, I'm doubtful. I don't see how it can be resolved in even the medium term. In the long term, who knows?
Right.
But if you ask me to forecast, I would say I do not see any circumstances on which this can be realistically resolved. The parties are just too far apart. They may form alliances, like among the opposition, the Al-Nusra Front and so-called official opposition, which the Americans and others are backing. But these tend to be tactical. And we can see among the radical regimes, Al-Nusra Front representing a kind of Al-Qaeda segment of the Syrian population, and ISIS, how belief systems and tactical questions tend to drive divisions amongst those who want dramatic change. And we're in a situation, I think, both in Iraq and in Syria, where no one party is powerful enough to subdue the others. Now, it seems to me that one can make a case that the Assad regime in Damascus is the least of all possible evils.
Right.
Simply because it has a track record, and a track record which allowed you, provided you forewent individual or group opinions, you forewent political organization, even social organization, and what have you, and deferred to the regime, you could be relatively safe. In fact, I've heard Iraqis say, give us the old days. At least we could predict from day to day what was going to happen to us.
Right.
They can't do that anymore. So in both cases, I think the Iranian influence, the Saudi influence is going to be, in a sense, malevolent, and it will continue to feed this divide because they too are motivated by religious, by ethnic, and other forms of competition. So that will continue to feed this. Left alone, I don't think that the citizens of Syria or Iraq have the mechanisms, the tools, the understanding, the ability to accommodate each other that would be necessary to effect a relatively satisfactory state structure.
Right.
In other words, it seems to me that the primary loyalty of the Shia is to the Shia.
Right.
The primary loyalty of Sunni is to the Sunni. Now, many people can say, well, this is oversimplified, and of course it is.
Right.
But I'm trying to make a point that ethno-nationalism crosses borders, whereby those particular identities, whatever they may be, are more important than being a Syrian,
right,
or being an Iraqi, or being Lebanese, or being Jordanian. And we can see that in the appeal that ISIS, for instance, has, setting up a caliphate that stretches from one end of Syria to the other end of Iraq, saying, we are a common people, we have a certain ideology to which all believers must be forced to adhere.
Right.
Transcending, almost viewing the Syria-Iraq border as a historic injustice put in place by the peacemakers at the end of the First World War, when
right,
the place was carved up by them. And that we have to, for the greater good, because the deity speaks to us. And when the deity speaks to one, how does one have a choice but to respond in the affirmative?
Right.
The problem is that the deity speaks with many voices, it seems. And so we have this lack of real accommodation. There's one possible, and I thought about this quite a bit, one possible approach that theoretically could work. And that is, if you ever got to a point where it was decided, as it more or less has been in Lebanon, that you might have a formal structural organizational government process, but the real decisions would be made by ethnic groups, the leadership of ethnic groups behind the scenes. In other words, you've got a Lebanese parliament, great, but who decides those? The leadership of these movements sitting behind closed doors, whether you're Christian, Maronite, Sunni, Shia, whatever, Druze, and you sit there and you say, well, I need this for my people, or I need this, or I want these. In other words, that those leaders have legitimacy among their own people, and then they divide up the pie in a common governance structure where the government process can return the necessary goods, services, and feeling of fulfillment
right,
that individual communities want and need. How you get there, I have no idea. I don't think you'll be able to.
right.
But at least that shows you a kind of model which conceivably could be implemented, barring the return to the kind of state structures that we in the West are so useful, and made the terrible assumption, particularly the American administration and American neoconservatives, that system, our system, could be exported to other countries who would automatically embrace it.
Right.
So right were we in what we had chosen and evolved into.
Michael, this has been absolutely fascinating. We're out of time, but thank you so much for being on the show.
I'm very glad to have been here.
And thank you to our audience for tuning in. You've been watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us online at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter.